I don't usually talk about what happened at Camp Harlow. Most people who were involved don't. Not because we were told not to, though we were, in the vague bureaucratic way institutions have of telling you things without actually saying them out loud. More because there's no clean way to describe it that doesn't make you sound like you've either lost your mind or are trying to sell something. I'm not trying to sell anything. I'm not even sure I want to be believed. I just need to put it somewhere outside my own head. My name is Daniel Reyes. I worked for the Forest Service for 11 years, the last 4 of those as a district resource coordinator out of the Bridger-Teton National Forest in Wyoming. That's a job title that sounds more important than it is. Mostly I pushed paper. I coordinated equipment requests between the district offices and the regional office in Ogden. I reviewed environmental assessments. I sat in on interagency meetings where everyone was very busy pretending to agree with each other. Before that, I'd been a backcountry ranger, which I genuinely loved, but I'd worn my left knee down to something my orthopedist described as essentially gravel, and the backcountry requires knees. So I moved into administration and tried to find a way to feel okay about it. By the fall of the year I'm talking about, I'd been behind a desk for going on 3 years. My ex-wife Carolyn had moved to Portland with our daughter Mia, which was a reasonable decision on both their parts and a gut shot for me. I was living in a rental apartment in Jackson that smelled faintly of someone else's dog, driving 40 minutes to work each way, eating frozen burritos more often than I'd like to admit. I wasn't depressed exactly. I was just a little hollowed out. There's a difference, even if it's hard to explain. The assignment that eventually took me to Camp Harlow came through my supervisor, Len Bridges, on a Tuesday morning in early October. Len was the kind of manager who delivered news with a lot of throat clearing and legal pad consulting, which usually meant the news was either boring or bad. He called me into his office, which had a view of the parking lot and a whiteboard covered in acronyms no one used anymore, and told me that a joint research station up in the Gros Ventre wilderness had gone quiet. He used that word, quiet. Not offline, not unresponsive, quiet. Camp Harlow was a cooperative research station run jointly by the Forest Service and the University of Wyoming's Ecology Department. It had been operational for about 6 years, studying long-term carbon sequestration patterns in old-growth conifer stands at high altitude. Not glamorous science, very slow science. The kind of science that requires someone to go back to the same trees every few weeks and measure things and write them down, year after year, long enough to see if anything is actually changing. There was a permanent staff of 3 at the station during the active research season, which ran from June through late October, when the access road usually became impassable. The 3 people stationed there were Dr. Annika Solberg, the lead researcher, a Norwegian woman in her mid-50s who'd been with the project since its 2nd year, Marcus Webb, her research assistant, who was working on his dissertation at UW and had been at the station for 2 full seasons, and a Forest Service facilities tech named Roy Castillo, whose job was to keep the equipment running and the roof on. They'd missed their weekly check-in on Friday. The university's research office called the Forest Service's regional coordinator on Monday morning. By Tuesday afternoon, it was in Len's lap. By Wednesday morning, it was in mine. The access road's still open, Len told me, tapping his legal pad. Barely. There was some storm activity up there last week, but the plows went through on Saturday. You should be able to get up to the trailhead with the district truck. What about a welfare check from the county? It's federal land. Fremont County defers to us on the initial contact. We can call them in if needed. And you want me to go because... Len clicked his pen a few times. You have the backcountry certification. The other coordinators don't. It's a 4-mile hike in once you leave the truck. I haven't done a field assignment in 3 years. It's a welfare check, Daniel. You hike in, make sure they're okay, figure out why the radio's not working, hike out. You'll probably be back by Friday. He said, probably the way people say probably when they're not really sure, but don't want to negotiate. I told him I'd need to check out equipment from the district cache. He told me to take whatever I needed. I told him I'd leave Thursday morning. I went back to my desk and pulled up the camp's file on the shared drive. There wasn't much. a facilities report from August, a research summary from the previous October that Dr. Solberg had submitted before they'd closed the station for winter, a site plan showing the camp's layout, a radio frequency list, a protocol document for field check-ins that had been last updated in 2019. I read through all of it twice, mostly out of habit. The facilities report noted that the generator had been showing some irregular cycling and that a replacement part had been ordered and presumably arrived by now. The research summary was dense with abbreviations and carbon isotope ratios that I couldn't parse but that seemed, based on the conclusion section, to be finding what they expected to find. The site plan showed the main research cabin, a small equipment shed, a weather station, 3 permanent sampling plots marked with GPS coordinates, and a satellite uplink antenna on the north side of the cabin roof. That last part was worth noting. They weren't just on radio. They had a satellite uplink for data transfer, which meant if the radio was down, there should have been a secondary way to reach them, and apparently there wasn't. I wrote that down and circled it. Then I went home and packed a bag. The drive to the trailhead took me north from Jackson, through the forest on Highway 191, then east on a dirt road that had a number but no name, climbing into the upper Gros Ventre drainage. The aspens were finished by then, their leaves long gone, the white trunks standing bare and clean against the lodgepole behind them. The sky was the particular shade of October blue you only get at altitude, almost purple at the edges, with high thin cirrus catching the morning light. My knee ached from the clutch on the mountain sections. I drank bad gas station coffee and listened to a Wyoming public radio program about water rights that I couldn't follow but found vaguely comforting. The trailhead parking area was a widening of the dirt road with 2 wooden posts and a rusted metal sign that said Gros Ventre Wilderness in raised letters that someone had painted over at least twice. There was no other vehicle there. I'd half expected to see their Forest Service truck, but the site plan had noted the camp's vehicle was stored in a barn about 3 miles down the access road, not at the trailhead, to prevent someone from walking off with it. I parked and got my gear sorted. I was carrying a 40-liter pack with 3 days of food, a first aid kit that was probably over-equipped, my handheld radio, a satellite communicator as backup, a headlamp, an extra set of batteries for everything, a basic repair kit for common equipment failures, and a printed copy of the camp's file. I had my Forest Service credentials in a chest pocket. I had my personal phone, though I knew from the topo map that I'd lose signal within half a mile. I had a paper map and a compass because I still don't fully trust GPS when you're above 9,000 feet in October. The trail wasn't marked particularly well. It showed up on the maps as a user-created route rather than a maintained path, which is Forest Service speak for someone started hiking it enough years ago that it became a trail whether anyone planned for that or not. It was clear enough to follow without the map. The first mile climbed through lodgepole pine on a moderate grade, nothing my knee would complain about too badly if I kept the pace reasonable. Above that, it opened into a mixed stand of Engelmann spruce and subalpine fir, the ground underneath a deep mat of brown needles, the air noticeably colder than it had been in the parking lot. I walked slowly. My knee wanted me to walk slowly, and the terrain agreed. I stopped twice to take bearings against the GPS, which showed me on track. At about 2.5 miles, I crossed a small drainage on a log bridge that someone had installed, with real bolts and brackets, which suggested this trail had gotten some unofficial maintenance at some point. The creek below it was low and clear, running over granite. A dipper worked the far bank, bobbing the way they do, hunting something under the surface. I watched it for a minute, which is the kind of thing you stop doing when you've been behind a desk too long, and then remember to do again when you're back in the field. The last 1.5 miles climbed more steeply, switchbacking up through a talus slope where the trail was marked with cairns because the bare rock didn't hold a path well. My knee was making itself known by then, a low grinding ache along the outside of the joint that I knew from experience would even out once I stopped climbing. The wind picked up on the exposed section, coming from the northwest with some real teeth to it. I came over a rocky lip at the top of the switchbacks, and there was Camp Harlow below me, in a small, flat-bottomed basin ringed on 3 sides by trees and on the north by another rock face. It was maybe 4 acres of open ground, with the research cabin in the center, the equipment shed to the east, the weather station mast visible about 100 yards south of the cabin, and the sampling plots marked by their orange flagging tape, which I could just barely pick out against the brown of the late-season grass. Nothing was moving. That wasn't by itself alarming. It was Thursday, mid-morning, and all 3 of them would reasonably be occupied somewhere that wasn't the front of the cabin. Still, I noted it. I stood at the lip of the basin for a few minutes and looked at the place before I walked down to it. The cabin looked intact. No broken windows I could see from distance. The antenna on the roof was still upright. Smoke from the stovepipe, which would have been the most reassuring thing, was absent. No smoke could mean the stove was off. Or it could mean the stove was off because nobody was there to run it. In October, at 11,000 feet, you don't leave a fire to die and then hang around the cabin. You leave a fire to die because you're going somewhere. I walked down into the basin. The cabin was maybe 800 square feet from the outside, which is not small for a research station, but is very small for 3 people living and working in the same space for 5 months. It was built in the Forest Service style of the 1990s, dark green paint, metal roof, porch along the front with a wooden bench and 2 hooks for gear. There were 2 pairs of boots on the porch, 1 pair of rubber knee-highs and 1 pair of lace-up hikers. Both were dry. Both were placed parallel, like someone had set them there deliberately. I knocked on the door and identified myself. No answer. I knocked again, louder. Still nothing. I tried the door handle and it opened without resistance. Unlocked. Inside smelled like cold and pine resin and coffee that had been made recently enough that the pot still had some warmth when I touched the carafe on the counter. I stood in the doorway and looked at the room before I went in. This is habit from the backcountry days, the same instinct you develop when you're checking on bear country camps or responding to an incident. You look before you step. You let the room tell you what it wants to tell you before you start moving things around. The main room was a combined kitchen, dining area, and workspace. There was a table with 4 chairs, 2 of which had jackets draped over them. There were 3 laptops on the table, all closed, all in sleep mode from the indicator lights. There were papers, printouts of what looked like data tables, scattered across one end of the table in a way that suggested someone had been working and had not finished or had walked away without stopping to organize. A mug of coffee, half full, sat beside one of the laptops. I pressed the back of my hand to the mug. Cold, but not refrigerator cold. Maybe 2 or 3 hours. On the counter near the sink was a dish rack with clean dishes in it. On the small 2-burner propane stove was a cast iron pan with some residue of scrambled eggs. On the wall beside the door was the radio setup, a shelf-mounted unit with a handset, a Marine-style VHF radio that the station used for local communication, and a small satellite phone cradled on a charging dock. The satellite phone's screen showed no signal. I keyed my handheld radio. Camp Harlow, this is District Coordinator Reyes. Do you copy? Nothing. This is Forest Service. Camp Harlow. Is anyone on frequency? Nothing. I noted my radio was showing 2 bars of signal to the local repeater, which was about what I'd expected this far from the nearest town. Marginal, but functional. I went back outside and walked around the perimeter of the cabin, looking for anything that would tell me which direction 3 people had gone on a cold October morning. To the north, toward the rock face, I found a path in the frost-softened ground leading toward the equipment shed. Fresh tracks, or not fresh exactly, but not old either. Multiple sets, overlapping, all heading toward the shed. The equipment shed was padlocked. I had a master key from the district cache that was supposed to open any Forest Service facility lock. It opened this one. Inside were the usual things: gas cans for the generator, which was housed in a lean-to on the back of the shed, a chest freezer for sample storage, metal shelving with equipment cases, a pegboard with hand tools, a workbench with a vise. There was also a field notes binder on the workbench, which I opened. The last entry was from Tuesday, 3 days ago. It was in handwriting I'd later confirm was Marcus's, based on comparison with the research summary document, and it said, temp, 29 degrees Fahrenheit, wind, NW 12 miles per hour, precipitation, none, sampling plots visited 1 and 2, soil cores collected per protocol, core tube samples labeled and stored, antenna calibration performed by Roy, nominal, generator running irregular again, notified Len, Dr. S continuing sediment work at North Face, dinner, pasta with canned sauce, Webb. That was it. 3 days ago, everything was routine enough that the field notes entry reads like a grocery list. Dinner, pasta with canned sauce, generator still misbehaving, North Face sediment work, antenna nominal. I went back to the cabin and found the camp's logbook, which was separate from the field notes, a large 3-ring binder on a shelf beside the radio. It had daily entries going back to the beginning of the season. I flipped to the back and found the same Tuesday entry, but in a different hand, Dr. Solberg's, tighter and more abbreviated. It mentioned the same temperature, the same wind. It mentioned that she'd collected 4 cores from the North Face outcrop and that the sample quality was, in her words, exceptional. It mentioned that the satellite uplink had been experiencing intermittent dropouts since the previous week and that she'd noted it in the equipment log. I found the equipment log. It was kept in a green folder on the radio shelf. The satellite entries went back to the previous Wednesday, a week before the Tuesday field notes. The first entry just said, uplink intermittent. The second, 2 days later, said uplink loss, 2-hour outage, reconnected. 3 days after that, uplink stable but degraded. The last entry was Saturday, 1 day after the missed check-in. 1 day after. It said uplink offline, VHF also offline, cause unknown, Roy investigating. That was all. No follow-up, no note from Roy about what he found, no entry for Sunday, no entry for Monday, no entry for Tuesday through Thursday, which was today. I sat down on one of the chairs at the table and thought about that for a while. The VHF had been working on Tuesday, based on Marcus's field notes. He would have mentioned if it wasn't. Roy had noted it offline on Saturday. But then Marcus's Tuesday entry, written after Roy's Saturday entry, didn't mention the radio being down, which meant either the radio had come back up between Saturday and Tuesday, or Marcus wasn't aware of Roy's Saturday entry, or Marcus had made his field note from a cached record and not from direct observation on that Tuesday. I'm not good at assuming the worst. Occupational habit from years of backcountry work, where the number of actually dangerous situations is vastly smaller than the number of situations that look dangerous from a distance. Most of the time, there is an explanation. Most of the time, the explanation is mundane. Generator part failure, equipment damage from the previous week's storm, someone with a stomach bug who couldn't make the check-in and didn't have a working secondary system to report that. But 3 people were gone from a station with warm coffee in the pot and boots on the porch and laptops in sleep mode and no note on the door, in October, at 11,000 feet, with no working communications. I tried the satellite phone. Still no signal. I tried my personal satellite communicator, which uses a different network. It connected. I sent a brief message to Len's work email. Arrived Camp Harlow. No personnel. Camp appears recently occupied. Radio and satellite uplink both offline. Investigating further. Will update by 1800. Then I put my pack down, poured the old coffee out in the sink, started fresh with the propane stove and the camp's supply, and settled in to wait for something to make sense. It didn't make sense, but I didn't know that yet. I spent the first hour doing what felt like the obvious thing, which was looking around the immediate area of the basin for the 3 of them. I did a systematic sweep, calling out every 30 seconds, covering the open ground, checking the weather station platform, following the paths to each of the 3 sampling plots. Plot 1 was about 200 yards south of the cabin, a 10-meter square area marked with orange flagging and a PVC pipe sunk into the ground with a data logger attached. The data logger was running, its little LED blinking green. Plot 2 was about 400 yards southeast, up a gentle slope into the trees. Same setup, same green LED. Plot 3 was at the western edge of the basin, where the trees got thick and the slope steepened, and the flagging there was partially torn, which might have been wind or might have been a branch coming down. I found nothing at any of the plots. No fresh sign, no voices, no footprints beyond the normal traffic you'd expect around research markers. The north face was the one Dr. Solberg's notes mentioned. I hadn't gone that way yet. The north face of the basin was the rock wall, a vertical escarpment of granite that rose maybe 80 feet above the basin floor, broken in a few places by ledges and crevices. It ran roughly east to west, maybe 300 feet across. At the base of it, in the loose talus and soil at the interface of rock and ground, was where she'd been doing her sediment work. I could see the site from across the basin, a small area of disturbed earth, a few wooden stakes with flagging, what looked like a canvas tarp weighed down with rocks that was covering something, probably a sample cache. I walked over. The tarp was covering 6 labeled core sample tubes, all neatly arranged and sealed, exactly as you'd expect. There were 3 shallow excavation pits in the soil nearby, and the tools for the work were still there. 2 trowels, a soil knife, a measuring tape, a field notebook. The field notebook was open and face down in the soil, the way you leave a book to mark your page when you're going to pick it up again in a minute. The pages were damp at the edges from morning frost. I picked it up carefully and looked at the open pages. Her handwriting was the same tight script I recognized from the logbook. The left page was a mostly complete data entry, sample depth measurements, field observations about layer composition, a small sketch of the stratigraphic column she was documenting. The right page was the one she'd been writing on when she stopped. About half of it was filled. The entries were in sequence, numbered. The last full entry was number 14, which noted a depth measurement and a sample weight, and a brief note that said something about the coloration being atypical. I'm paraphrasing, because the exact language was technical. Below entry 14 was the start of entry 15. She'd written the number and a depth measurement. Then in the middle of a word, the pen had dragged and stopped. Not a careful stopping, a mid-stroke stopping. The kind of thing that happens when you're writing and something else takes all of your attention immediately and completely. I looked at the rock face above me. Nothing moved. Wind in the trees at the top of the escarpment. A raven, somewhere, making its hollow knock. I photographed the notebook with my phone, put it back exactly as I'd found it, and walked back to the cabin. It was getting toward midday. I ate a sandwich I'd packed from Jackson and drank the coffee I'd made, which was better than the gas station stuff had been. I sat at the table with Dr. Solberg's logbook open and read back through it more carefully, starting from June. I was looking for anything that seemed off or worth noting, and mostly I found the normal rhythms of field research, weather observations, equipment notes, occasional personality glimmers in the language. She was dry and precise in her writing, but occasionally you got a sentence that wasn't. There was an entry from July that said the sunrise from the north face reminded her of a particular fjord back home, and she wasn't going to write the name because she'd made a rule about not being sentimental in the logbook. There was an entry from August where she'd clearly been frustrated with something Marcus had done wrong with the sample labeling, and the frustration showed in the clipped sentences, but then the next day's entry was back to normal, which told you something about her. Marcus's field notes, in the separate binder, were less polished. He wrote like someone who was still getting used to the format. Early in the season, there were occasional whole sentences that read like a journal rather than a log. By September, those had mostly been edited out, probably under direction, and what remained was more clinical. But I found a few observations that stood out. In late August, he'd written, "Weather unusual for time of year, temp inversion, fog in basin in AM, animals behaving strangely, mule deer herd that uses the south slope left the basin entirely by 0800, had not returned by end of day." Then the next day's entry didn't mention the deer. Then a week later there was a brief note, "Deer returned." I don't know why that stuck with me. Animals move around. Deer leave places and come back. That's not unusual. But I wrote it down anyway. Roy's log was the most functional of the three: pure equipment data, generator readings, antenna calibrations, fuel levels, maintenance performed. He kept meticulous records of what he'd done and when. I went through his entries and found the generator issue Marcus had mentioned. It had started showing irregular cycling in mid-September, and Roy's notes tracked it carefully over 6 weeks, recording the cycle times, comparing them to baseline specs, ordering the replacement part. The part had arrived on October 1st, and Roy had installed it on October 3rd. His October 3rd entry said, "Replacement governor installed, generator running within spec, problem resolved." And then 6 days later, on October 9th, which was the Saturday of the missed check-in, his entry said, "Communications failure, VHF offline, satellite uplink offline, root cause not yet determined. Investigating." That was the last entry in Roy's log. 6 days of nothing between the generator fix and the communications failure. And the generator fix itself was unremarkable, a routine maintenance resolution, the kind of thing that gets its own entry and then never gets mentioned again. I went back to the radio shelf. I looked more carefully at the VHF unit. From the outside, it looked normal. No obvious damage. The power indicator was dark, which meant it either wasn't getting power or had been switched off. I checked the power strip behind the shelf and found everything was plugged in and the strip was switched on. I traced the power cable from the VHF to the strip, intact. I turned the unit's power switch to off and then on again. Nothing. Dead. The satellite phone was the same story. Powered. No signal. I looked at the charging dock and found the dock was getting power, but the phone showed a charging indicator, which meant the hardware was working. The issue was network, not power. No signal meant either the antenna was damaged or the subscription had lapsed, or there was something physically blocking the signal, which at 11,000 feet with an unobstructed sky was hard to imagine. I went out and looked at the roof antenna. From below, I couldn't see any obvious physical damage. The mount looked solid. The cable from the antenna ran into a conduit that went through the south wall of the cabin, and I traced that inside to where it connected to the satellite phone dock. Everything looked intact. I checked my personal satellite communicator again. It showed a signal, but weakly, 2 bars instead of the 4 I'd had an hour ago. I sent another message to Len. Radio investigation ongoing. No obvious cause. No personnel located on site. All 3 sampling plots checked. Investigating North Face area. No incidents found. Standing by. The message sent. So my unit was working, and the network was accessible, at least from my device, which meant the station's equipment had failed in a way that had nothing to do with network availability. Equipment failure, both units, simultaneously, was possible. Unlikely, but possible. Generator issues could cause power irregularities that damage sensitive electronics. Roy's generator notes had described irregular cycling for weeks before the fix. Maybe the cycling had done some damage that took time to manifest. That made sense. That was the explanation I chose to hold on to for the next hour or so while I continued looking around. I found something in the early afternoon that I couldn't explain as easily. It was in the equipment shed, on the workbench, underneath a piece of canvas that I'd looked past on my first visit. I'd seen the canvas and assumed it was covering a piece of equipment. It was. It was covering the satellite uplink box, which was the separate, larger system for data transmission, distinct from the satellite phone. This was the one that transferred the research data to the university servers. Roy had mentioned it in his communication failure entry along with the VHF. The satellite uplink box had been partially disassembled. The back panel was off. The internal components were exposed. Several things were immediately apparent. The board looked intact. No obvious burn marks or failed components I could identify. But the cable that connected the uplink box to the roof antenna was coiled separately on the workbench beside it. Disconnected. Not cut. Not damaged, just disconnected and neatly coiled. Roy had disconnected it himself. I looked at the coiled cable for a long time. You don't disconnect a cable and then note in the logbook that communications are offline without explanation. You note that you disconnected the cable and explain why. That's basic. Roy's logs were meticulous. His October 9th entry was the one place in 6 months of meticulous logging where he'd left out the reason. Unless he hadn't had time to write the reason. Unless something else had happened that Saturday that made the full entry impossible. I went back to the cabin and sat with the logbook again. I reread Saturday's entry 3 more times. Nothing between the lines that I could find. Just communications failure, VHF offline, satellite uplink offline, root cause not yet determined, investigating. But I now knew the root cause of the satellite uplink failure. Roy had disconnected it, intentionally. Before writing that entry, or at the same time, or after, I called Len on my satellite communicator. He picked up on the 3rd ping. "Daniel, you there? I'm at the station. Nobody's here. I found some things that don't add up." I told him about the coiled cable. I told him about the mid-sentence field notebook. I told him about the coffee and the boots and the laptops. Len was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Weather? Clear. Cold but clear. No sign of storm damage at the site. What about an unplanned excursion? Research purposes? Maybe they went up into the drainage above the basin for something. Possible. I'll check. But Len, they left coffee half drunk and a notebook open face down in the dirt. That's not a planned excursion." Another pause. "I'm going to call UW. Get someone from the research office who knows the project. And I'll notify Fremont County so they're on standby if we need SAR." "Good. I'll keep looking. I'll check in at 6. I spent the rest of the afternoon covering ground I hadn't covered yet. The drainage above the basin, which required some scrambling on the northeast side where the rock face had a break in it, a sort of natural ramp that someone had scratched boot tracks into over the years. Above the basin was a gentler slope, more open, alpine meadow transitioning to rock field higher up, the kind of ground where you could see a long way. I climbed until I had a view of the drainage for maybe a mile in each direction and scanned with my binoculars. Nothing. No movement. No color that didn't belong. No shapes that resolved into people. The wind up there was sharp and cold, and I could see a weather system building in the northwest, maybe 30 miles out, the kind of anvil-headed formation that doesn't always mean snow at this elevation, but usually does. I came back down into the basin as the afternoon light began to angle. The shadows in the basin were long and cold, and the temperature was dropping faster than I'd expected. I hadn't packed for an overnight outside the cabin, but I had enough gear to be comfortable inside the cabin, and being inside the cabin felt like the right call when a weather system was building. I turned the propane stove on for heat, which wasn't its purpose but worked well enough, and I sat at the table with the logbooks spread in front of me and my notes in my own small notebook, trying to build a picture that made sense. 3 people, gone, camp apparently occupied within the last several hours, based on the coffee temperature and the fresh eggs in the pan. Communication systems offline, at least one of them deliberately disconnected. Fieldwork abandoned mid-task. 2 pairs of boots on the porch, which meant at least 2 people had gone somewhere in shoes rather than boots. That last part. I kept coming back to that. Nobody goes hiking in Wyoming mountain terrain in October in shoes. You'd know that. I knew that. Dr. Solberg would certainly know that. Marcus had been there 2 full seasons. He'd know it. Roy's whole job was field maintenance. He'd been wearing those hikers for months, and he'd know. People don't choose to go on an outdoor excursion at 11,000 feet in October without the right footwear. Unless they didn't choose. Unless whatever had them moving was moving them fast enough that footwear was not the priority. Or unless they hadn't gone outside at all. Unless they were somewhere inside the immediate site perimeter, somewhere I hadn't found. I went back out in the fading light and did something I should have done earlier. I opened the generator lean-to, which was attached to the back of the equipment shed. It was small, maybe 8 by 12 feet, with the generator taking up most of the space. I looked in the corners, under the small workbench, behind the fuel cans. Nothing. There was also a storage space under the cabin. The cabin had been built on a raised foundation with a crawl space beneath it. There was an access hatch in the floor of a small mudroom just inside the front door. I'd noticed it on my first walkthrough and filed it away. I went back for it now. I lifted the hatch and shone my headlamp down. Concrete block piers, foam insulation on the underside of the floor joists, pipes, absolutely nothing else. I lowered the hatch and stood in the mudroom and acknowledged that I was now in a situation that was not going to resolve itself overnight. 3 people were missing from a research station in a wilderness area in October, with a storm building, and no working communications except my own personal device, which was showing declining signal. I called Len at 6 as promised. SAR can mobilize tomorrow morning, he told me. Team out of Pinedale. Fremont County's cooperating. They want to put a helicopter up at first light if the weather allows. The weather's going to be an issue. There's a system coming in from the northwest. I'd give it 8 hours before it hits the basin. Can you hold position overnight? Yes. The cabin's intact and stocked. Don't go anywhere in the dark, Daniel. I know, Len. I mean it. I know how you get. He knew how I got, because he'd known me for 9 years. The way I got was that I went looking for things when people told me not to, which was usually fine, because I was careful and experienced, and occasionally less fine, which was why he felt the need to say it. I'll stay in the cabin, I said. I made dinner from the camp's food stores, which felt odd, using 3 people's supplies with 3 people missing, but also felt practical, which I think is just how I'm built. There was rice and canned beans and some freeze-dried vegetables, and I made a serviceable pot of it and ate at the table with the logbooks still spread around me. I read Roy's log from the beginning because I hadn't done that yet, and I thought there might be something in the early months that rhymed with what I was seeing now. Roy was a thorough man, from his notes. He wrote clearly and specifically. He caught things. In June, he'd noted an issue with the weather station data logger that turned out to be a firmware version mismatch. In July, he'd found a crack in the cabin's foundation on the north side and photographed it and sent the photos to the regional facilities office, noting that the crack was not currently structural but should be monitored. In August, he'd done a full inventory of fuel supplies and noted they were adequate for the season, but would benefit from an additional delivery. All of this was competent, proactive maintenance work. But there was something in August and September that I hadn't caught on my first read. Roy had been writing a second set of notes. Not in the official log, on a separate notepad, spiral bound, which I found tucked behind the official log binder when I went looking. The handwriting was the same but looser, more hurried, like notes you take for yourself rather than for a record. I don't know if I was supposed to find it. There was nothing on it that said private or keep out. It was just there, tucked behind the binder, and I found it. The early notes in the spiral pad were mundane: shopping lists, mileage records for his personal vehicle back in Lander, a to-do list for something he was working on at home. Then there was a gap of a few pages that had been carefully torn out. Then more notes, starting in what I estimated as late August, based on the approximate timing of what they described. The first note in the new sequence was brief, 3 lines. It said, "Second time I've heard it. Same direction. Asked M about it, but he said he hadn't heard anything. Maybe nothing. Note for myself in case it happens again." I read that 3 times. No explanation of what it was. No description. Just heard it. Same direction. The next entry, undated, was longer. Checked the antenna mount today. Wasn't planning to, but the hearing from last night was definitely from the North Face area. Mount is fine. No reason to be up there except I went anyway. At the base of the rock, in the soft ground near where A does her sediment work, there are impressions. I've been trying to figure out what made them, and I can't. Not bear. I know bear track. Not elk. Too irregular. Photographed them. Photo is on my laptop. Going to look at it more carefully. I set the spiral pad down. I went to the table and opened one of the laptops. It asked for a password. I didn't have the password. I tried the other 2. Both asked for passwords. The photos Roy mentioned were behind a password I didn't have. I read the rest of the spiral pad standing at the counter, which is the kind of thing I sometimes do when I need to stay alert. There were 6 more entries, each separated from the last by what seemed like 2 to 4 days based on the context. They went like this: more or less. The impressions were back, fresh, after the rain, bigger than the ones from before. Maybe I measured wrong the first time. A doesn't go up to the north face on the days I've been finding them at the base, I checked. That's relevant, I think. The soft ground there is only showing one set of impressions at a time, not multiple animals, I don't think. Just one, whatever it is. Then, asked Len about wildlife management plan for the area. Tried to do it casually. He got confused and thought I was asking about predator activity protocol. Sent me the standard gray wolf protocol document, which is not what I meant. Didn't push it. We'll try a different approach. Then, heard it again last night, about 0200. I went to the window, didn't go outside. North face. Like something moving on the rock. Too deliberate for rock fall. Rocks fall in patterns that match gravity. This moved laterally. I know how that sounds, and I'm writing it for myself so I can say it plainly. Something moved laterally along the north face in the dark. I don't know what. Then, with what felt like a longer gap before it, A has been at the north face site every day this week. I mentioned the impressions to her without specifics, said I'd noticed some unusual wildlife sign. She was interested, but in the way she is when she's being polite. M overheard and asked if I meant the disturbance at the base of the southwest section. I didn't know about a southwest section disturbance. Asked him to show me. He took me there at end of day. It's different from my site. This is not impressions. This is more like something has been pressing against the rock itself. Not scratching, pressing. The granite has been abraded in a way I can't account for. I took more photos. Then, I'm going to disconnect the satellite uplink. This is a decision I've thought about for a week. I am going to write the reason here, and then I'm going to think about whether to tell A and M. The reason is, the uplink antenna calibration data from the last 2 weeks shows that when I run the calibration sweep, it's picking up a signal it shouldn't be picking up. Not from orbit, from below, from inside the basin or close to it. A signal that's not supposed to be there. The frequencies are outside the normal range for any equipment we have at this station. I've been logging it without reporting it because I wanted to understand it first. I don't understand it. What I understand is that a signal from the basin at these frequencies, if it's being relayed through our uplink, is going somewhere I didn't intend and I don't know where. So I'm disconnecting the uplink. Then the VHF as well, because I need to check it for the same issue. Then I'm going to tell the others what I found. That was the second to last entry. The last entry was 3 words. It said, "It knows now." I put the spiral pad on the table and sat back down. I looked at those 3 words for a while, and I think what I felt was not quite fear, not yet, but a rearrangement of things, like when you've been looking at a picture and you suddenly see the other thing in it that the picture was actually showing the whole time. It knows now. I didn't know what it was or what it knew. I didn't know if Roy had been having a rational response to something genuinely strange, or if he'd been living alone at 11,000 feet for too long and had developed a fixation. Both were possible. Both had happened to competent people in isolated places before. But the impressions at the base of the north face, whatever they were real enough that he'd photographed them. The signal the antenna had picked up was in the calibration data, which was presumably somewhere on his laptop or in the equipment log if I knew where to look. And the disconnected cable, the one I'd found coiled on the workbench, was consistent with exactly what he described. Roy had disconnected the uplink because he was afraid the station's equipment was transmitting something to somewhere he couldn't identify. And then, 3 days later, 3 people were gone from the station, with coffee half drunk and notebooks face down in the dirt. I tried my satellite communicator again. 1 bar. Message to Len. Found additional material in facility. Roy Castillo may have had information about a situation at the site that requires follow-up. SAR advised to proceed at first light regardless of weather. I'm secure in the cabin. I sent the message and watched the indicator until it showed delivered. Then I tried to sleep. The sleeping arrangements in the cabin were 3 cots in a back room, separated from the main room by a thin plywood partition. Each had a sleeping bag and a personal storage shelf. I could tell which cot was Dr. Solberg's, because of the Norwegian paperback novel on the shelf above it. Marcus's had a phone charger cable and 2 granola bars and a worn copy of a dissertation committee handbook. Roy's had a field guide to Rocky Mountain mammals and a framed photograph of 2 kids at a beach that made me pause, because having a photograph at a remote station meant you'd been here long enough for the place to feel worth personalizing. I took the one empty cot, which left me wondering where Roy had been sleeping before I arrived, and whether that was a thing I needed to think about or just a coincidence of space. I left the stove on low for heat. I left my headlamp on the floor within reach. I lay on the cot with my clothes on and thought about the last entry in Roy's spiral pad. It knows now. It knows that the uplink is disconnected. That's one reading. Whatever signal was coming from the basin, whatever was generating it, it would know that the relay was gone, that it wasn't being transmitted anymore. Or it knows that Roy had been tracking the signal, that Roy was aware of it, that the act of disconnecting the uplink was an act of acknowledgement. Or Roy had been spooked by something and was writing in a register that doesn't really parse literally. That happens too. People at altitude in isolation for months sometimes develop language for their own fear that doesn't mean what it says. I lay there a long time before I slept. The temperature outside dropped sharply after midnight. I could hear the wind picking up against the metal roof, which rang like a low note in a room with bad acoustics. Once, somewhere in what I estimated was the 2 a.m. range, I heard something that was not wind and not the roof. It was outside and to the north, toward the rock face. A sound I couldn't immediately classify. Not an animal call, not rockfall. More like a resonance, a frequency at the edge of what you'd call a sound, the kind of thing you feel as much as hear. I lay still and listened to it for maybe 3 minutes, and then it stopped, and I lay still for another 20 minutes, waiting to see if it returned. It didn't return. I filed it, and eventually I slept. I woke up at 05:30 to darkness and the sound of snow on the roof. The storm had come earlier than I'd projected. Outside the cabin, in the beam of my headlamp, the basin was white. Not deep snow, maybe 3 inches, but falling steadily from a sky the color of concrete. The temperature on the outdoor thermometer mounted beside the door read 14 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind had dropped, but the snow was still coming. I made coffee and checked my satellite communicator. There was a message from Len, time-stamped 0455, weather window narrow. Helicopter hold at Pinedale. Possible lift 0900 if conditions improve. Ground team at Trailhead by 0700. Stay in place. I texted back, confirmed, staying in place. Then I went back to the equipment shed with my headlamp and looked at the uplink box again. I wanted to see if there was any way to access the calibration data without the laptop. Sometimes these units stored data internally on a compact flash card or internal memory. Roy's log had mentioned calibration sweeps. If he'd been saving them, there was a chance the data was on the unit itself rather than only on the laptop. I looked at the unit for 20 minutes before I found the slot, which was on the side panel rather than the back, partially obscured by the mounting bracket. It held a compact flash card with the Forest Service asset tag on it. I took the card out carefully and put it in my pocket. I didn't have a card reader with me. I had my laptop in Jackson. I couldn't read the card until I was back at the truck, but having it felt important. I was standing there in the shed with the card in my pocket when I heard it again, clearer than the night before. Louder, coming from the north, beyond the cabin, in the direction of the rock face. That same quality, not quite a sound, and not quite not a sound, like something pressing against the lower edge of hearing, like a frequency you're not supposed to be detecting at all. I stood very still, and I listened. And while I was listening, I became aware, in the way you become aware of things in quiet, enclosed places, that the frequency was changing. Not loudly, not dramatically. It was sweeping, moving through a range of frequencies, slow and methodical, up and then back down and then up again. The way you'd sweep a dial on a radio, the way you'd scan through channels looking for something, or for someone. I went back to the cabin. I want to be honest about this. I went back to the cabin quickly. Not running, because I am not someone who runs from sounds, but I moved with purpose, and I did not look back at the rock face as I walked, which I think is a thing I was doing deliberately, whether it was rational to do it deliberately or not. Inside, I sat at the table, and I thought about Roy's note. The antenna had been picking up a signal from inside the basin, at frequencies outside the normal range, and he'd written that disconnecting the uplink meant it knows now. He'd been worried about transmission, about the signal going somewhere unintended through the station's uplink. What if the reverse was also possible? What if the signal wasn't only going out through the uplink, but also coming in? What if the station's communications equipment, the VHF, the satellite phone, the uplink, had all been not just relaying something, but also receiving something? And if the equipment was now offline, both the VHF and the satellite phone dead, the uplink disconnected, what would something that communicated through those frequencies do next? It would look for another channel. I looked at the 3 laptops on the table. 3 laptops in sleep mode. 3 laptops that were presumably connected to the camp's local network, which ran through a router on the radio shelf, which had its own external antenna mounted on the cabin wall. I got up and looked at the router. It was a standard commercial unit, nothing special. The external antenna on the wall was a small omnidirectional whip, the kind you'd see on any rural internet setup. The router was still powered. Its indicator lights were showing normal operation, green across the board. Which was worth noting, because the VHF was dead, and the satellite phone had no signal, and the satellite uplink was physically disconnected, but the local network router was still running fine. I don't know exactly what I thought I was doing when I turned the router off. I reached behind it and unplugged the power cable, and the lights went out, and the external antenna went dead. The sound from the north face stopped. Not gradually, not fading. It stopped, and the absence of it was sharp and clean, and the cabin was quieter than it had been since I'd arrived. I stood at the radio shelf with the power cable in my hand, and I let myself feel what I was feeling, which was something I'd describe as a very cold and very specific kind of fear, the kind that doesn't make you want to run, but makes you want to become extremely still and think very carefully. Then I plugged the router back in. Nothing happened for a moment. The lights came back up, green across the board. I waited. 20 seconds. 30. Then the sound came back, faint, at the edge of perception, getting stronger. I unplugged the router again. The sound stopped. I did this 3 times. Plug in, sound, unplug, silence. By the 3rd iteration, it wasn't an experiment anymore, it was a confirmation, and I sat with that confirmation in a way I think I'll be sitting with for the rest of my life. Something in the basin was using the camp's network equipment to communicate. I sent a message to Len. I tried to keep the language factual and not alarming, because Len was a pragmatic man who responded better to facts than to alarm, and because if I wrote what I was actually thinking, there was a real chance he'd escalate in a direction that wouldn't help. I wrote, "Strong evidence that station equipment is involved in anomalous signal activity. Recommend full communications review by technical staff on arrival. SAR priority should remain personnel location." Len wrote back 20 minutes later. Helicopter lifted from Pinedale at 0835. ETA to your position, approximately 0950 weather permitting. Ground team 10 minutes behind you on trail. I wrote, "Copy." I sat with the router unplugged and the cabin quiet, and I thought about the 3 people who were supposed to be here and weren't. I thought about Roy's photograph of 2 kids at a beach. I thought about Dr. Solberg's rule against being sentimental in the logbook, which she'd broken once for a fjord she missed. I thought about Marcus's dissertation committee handbook, worn at the spine, something a person carries when they're still trying to prove they belong somewhere. I thought about the boots on the porch, 2 pairs, and the 3rd pair, which I'd been looking for since I arrived and hadn't found, which was Roy's hikers, which I'd identified from the field notes as what he wore. Roy's boots weren't on the porch. Roy had gone somewhere with his boots on, or he'd been wearing them when he went, or they were somewhere in the cabin I hadn't looked. I looked now, under the cots, in the mudroom, in the small bathroom, no boots. Roy had his boots on when he left. Or when he was taken, if I was willing to use that word, which I wasn't, because I was trying to maintain the register of a competent field person conducting a welfare check, rather than the register of someone building a narrative around something they didn't understand. But the boots were gone. That was real. The helicopter came over the basin at 09:47 by my watch, low and banking hard in the snow that was still coming down. I'd gone outside with my headlamp switched to flash mode, which is the signal code we use for aircraft location, and the helicopter circled twice and then came down on the open ground south of the cabin, where the snow was flat and unobstructed. The rotor wash hit me like a wall of frozen air, and I turned my back to it and waited. 2 people came out of the helicopter. One I didn't recognize, a young woman in SAR gear with a pack and a medical kit. The other was a man in his 50s, in a Forest Service jacket, who walked with a slight limp, and who I did recognize, though not from my district. Dave Morrow. He was out of the regional office in Ogden, which was 2 levels above Len in the organization. He was the kind of person who showed up when something was above the level of a local matter. "Reyes," he said, when he got close enough. "Morrow," I said. "Didn't expect you. Len called me last night. Walk me through what you've got." I walked him through the cabin and the equipment shed and the north face and the logbooks and the spiral pad. I showed him the disconnected cable. I showed him the empty equipment bay where the compact flash card had been, which I mentioned carefully, not mentioning that the card was in my pocket. I showed him the boots on the porch and the empty cot space and the field notebook face down in the dirt, which had since been dusted with snow. I did not show him Roy's spiral pad. When he was looking at the roof antenna, I quietly put the spiral pad inside the waistband of my pants, under my jacket, which is a thing I've never done before with official government property and which I'm not proud of. But I'd read Roy's entries enough times to have them close to memorized, and what I'd internalized was that Roy had been managing something carefully, incrementally, and that the management of it had not involved the regional office. Whatever Roy had known, he'd known it at his own pace and on his own terms, and something in the way he wrote made me feel that I owed him the right to continue being known that way. I'm not sure that's a rational argument. I'm telling you what I thought at the time. Morrow took the SAR tech, whose name was Gina, and they did their own sweep of the basin while I made hot drinks in the cabin. The ground team arrived an hour later, 4 people from Fremont County SAR, with a dog, a Belgian Malinois named Kessler who worked missing persons. Kessler was given article items from each of the 3 missing people's personal effects and sent into the basin. The dog worked efficiently. He covered the sampling plots and the equipment shed and the north face with his handler, and then he came back and sat at the handler's feet in a way that handlers sometimes describe as the negative indication, meaning the dog has done its work and the person is not in the area, not in the area, not in the basin. Morrow gathered everyone in the cabin and ran a brief situation report. He was calm and organized and said the words you say in these situations, that the priority was locating the personnel, that there were additional resources available, that we'd reassess at 1400 based on weather and search results. He pulled me aside after. "The logbook," he said. "You read all of it?" I did. "Castillo's equipment log?" "Yes." "Anything unusual in it?" I looked at him. "The communications failure entries, which you already saw. Nothing else. Nothing else in the official log." He caught that. He was good. His eyes moved slightly. "What does that mean, in the official log?" "It means that's what the official log contains." He looked at me for another moment, and then he said, "Where's the CF card from the uplink unit?" "What card?" "The unit in the shed has a data card slot." "It's empty. Cards don't walk away." "Maybe Castillo removed it when he was investigating the communications failure." "Maybe," Morrow said. He kept his eyes on me. "It would contain the antenna calibration data." "It would." "Which might tell us something about what was causing the failure." "It might. If you find it," Morrow said, "I'd appreciate you bringing it directly to me." "Of course," I said, and I did not bring it directly to him. I want to explain why. I'm not a person who normally conceals things from supervisors or lies to regional directors or pockets government property. I'm the kind of person who fills out forms completely and in a timely manner, and who reads the environmental compliance section of project documents with genuine attention. I am not a rule breaker. But Morrow had arrived fast. He'd come a long way from Ogden for a welfare check on a 3-person research station. He'd known about the CF card slot before he'd had time to properly read the equipment log. And his questions were specific in a way that suggested he already had information about what he was looking for, which meant someone had told him something I hadn't been told. Roy's last entry said, "It knows now," and the antenna calibration data had been showing a signal from inside the basin. And the camp's uplink had been connected to regional servers, which fed to the university's servers, which fed to wherever university data goes when it leaves Wyoming. There were a lot of nodes between this basin and wherever the calibration data ultimately landed. I'm not suggesting I knew what I was doing. I'm suggesting I didn't know what I was doing, but something told me to be careful about who I handed things to, and I listened to that something. The search continued through the afternoon. 3 additional searchers came in on foot, including a tracker named Carol, who read ground sign the way most people read text, fast and fluently, and with clear understanding. Carol worked the north face area for 2 hours and then came and found me. "The impressions in the soil," she said. "At the base of the rock. I saw them. What do you make of them?" She took a moment. Carol was not a person who offered premature conclusions, which I appreciated. "I make that they're real, that there are a lot of them, and that they were made by something I haven't encountered before. I don't mean that in a dramatic way. I mean I can't identify the origin. The diameter is wrong for anything native to this region. The depth pattern is wrong for any gate I know. And they stop. Stop. At the rock. There are impressions up to the rock face and then no impressions on the other side. Whatever made them went up the rock. Or into it," I said, which was a stupid thing to say out loud, and I regretted it as soon as I said it. Carol looked at me without expression. "Or into it," she agreed, in the tone of someone repeating something they're filing under possible explanations that they also don't want to think about too hard. We both looked at the rock face. At 1400, Morrow called the full team in and said the search was expanding. He was requesting 2 additional aircraft, including a thermal imaging helicopter and a 6-person mounted search team to cover the drainage above the basin. He said the conditions were deteriorating, which was true. The snow had picked up again and was now falling at about 1 inch per hour. He said field personnel should use the cabin as a base through the night. I asked him if he'd been briefed on any previous reports from the station. He said no. I asked him if he was aware of the signal anomalies in the antenna calibration data. He said, "What signal anomalies?" I described Roy's equipment log entries, the ones in the official log, which Morrow should have read. He listened with a very neutral face and said he'd noted those entries and they'd been referred to the facility's technical team. "Has the facility's technical team ever responded to anything like that before?" I asked. "Not that I'm aware of." "Has this district had any other reports of unexplained signal sources?" "Not that I'm aware of," he said again, in the same tone. He was aware of something. I was sure of it, and I had no way to prove it. The second night at Camp Harlow was harder than the first. There were 8 of us in the cabin now, which meant sleeping bags on the floor and people taking turns at the cots. Morrow claimed 1 cot on the basis of seniority. I took the floor near the front door, partly because I am a practical person who understands that floor space near the door is what's left when you're last to choose, and partly because I wanted to be near the router. I'd left the router unplugged all day during the search. Nobody had asked about it, and I'd positioned a pack in front of it to reduce the chance of someone casually plugging it back in. I didn't plug it in that night. The sound from the north face came anyway. I heard it at about 0100, fainter than before, the same sweeping quality, the same not quite sound character. But without the router it was weaker, less present, like something trying to reach through a wall and not getting through it the way it had before. I lay still and listened and thought about signal, about frequency, about what a thing might do if its usual channels were closed off and it needed to find others. 2 people near me were snoring. One was murmuring in sleep. The cabin smelled like 8 adults who'd been working hard in cold weather. These were the most ordinary human things in the world, and I was lying in them listening to a frequency from a rock face at 11,000 feet and trying to hold both of those things in the same mind without one of them overriding the other. In the morning, before anyone else was fully awake, I slipped outside with my satellite communicator and the CF card. I didn't have a reader with me, but I had my laptop in the truck at the trailhead, and the trailhead was 4 miles down a trail I knew well enough to walk in the dark, in the snow, with a headlamp. I left a note on the table, took a weather reading, back by 0900. Reyes. That was technically a lie of omission, but I don't think I had good options. The trail in the new snow was quiet, and the sky was clearing, one of those sharp western breaks after a storm where the cold gets more severe, but the visibility becomes total. Stars over the ridgeline. The snow on the trail was maybe 4 inches, easy hiking, and my headlamp made a clean yellow circle ahead of me on the white path. My knee ached but held. I reached the truck at 0730. I got in and started it for heat, and I plugged the CF card into the reader on my laptop. The card had 63 files on it. 47 were routine calibration logs, time-stamped across the season, showing the antenna parameters and signal sweep data in a standard format. I opened the most recent 6, which corresponded to the period Roy had described in his spiral pad. The first 5 looked normal to me, or mostly normal. I don't have deep expertise in antenna calibration data, but I know enough to read the format and identify outliers. The parameters were within normal range with one consistent anomaly. On each of the 5 logs, at 0213 in the morning, there was a brief spike in the received data, a signal appearing on a frequency that was outside the station's intended operating range. Duration of the spike was between 4 and 11 seconds each time. The frequency wasn't constant. It was sweeping, the same sweeping quality I'd heard with my own body at the north face, moving up through a range and then back down. The 6th file was different. It was the last calibration run, time-stamped the night of October 9th, Saturday, the same day Roy had written his final equipment log entry. Roy had run a manual sweep at 0130 that morning, which was earlier than the normal 0213 time when the spikes had been appearing. He'd been trying to catch it, I think. He'd moved the sweep window earlier to get a longer look. He'd gotten what he was looking for. The file showed the signal clearly. Not a brief spike, but a sustained contact, lasting 42 minutes. During those 42 minutes, the signal had done something different. Instead of just sweeping, it had structured itself. The frequency shifts were shorter and more regular, repeating at specific intervals, specific durations. Pattern, repetition, something that, if you looked at it long enough, started to look like an attempt at something. Below the calibration data, Roy had added a text field. He'd typed notes directly into the file, which wasn't the standard way to document calibration data. He'd written 42-minute contact, 0131, 0213. Signal not noise, repeating structure, period approx 7.3 sec, attempting reverse sweep to see if signal responds to active transmission. Signal changed on active sweep, shifted to match transmit frequency within 4 sec. Signal has been maintaining transmit frequency match for 8 minutes. I stopped transmitting. Signal continued for 3 minutes, then shifted back to sweep mode, starting transmit again. Signal matched immediately, significantly faster than first contact. And then, below that, a final note that was shorter. I think it is learning the equipment. I am going to disconnect everything. I sat in my truck for a long time with that on my screen. Learning the equipment. A signal from inside the basin, appearing at the same time every night, getting faster at matching the station's transmission frequency. Getting better at the contact. And Roy had recognized it and been frightened enough to disconnect everything he could disconnect, and still not been frightened enough to leave. or not been given the chance. I called Len directly. I need you to get me the name of whoever in the regional office handles communications security, I said when he picked up. Daniel, Morrow's up there with you. This should go through. I know Morrow's up there. I need a name that isn't Morrow. Silence. Then, what's going on up there? I don't know exactly. I need someone who works in a technical capacity outside the operational chain. Security, maybe, or compliance. Forest Service doesn't really have a security division the way you're describing. What about interagency? Is there anyone from another agency embedded with the region? Another silence. Longer. Why are you asking me this, Daniel? Because I found something that I think needs to go somewhere other than through Morrow, and I'm not sure who that is. What did you find? I thought about how to say it. Evidence that the camp's communications equipment was being used to establish contact with a signal source of unknown origin inside the basin. Evidence that the signal was actively adaptive, responding to transmissions, learning the equipment parameters, and evidence that Castillo identified this and deliberately took the equipment offline before he and the other two disappeared. Len didn't say anything for a long time. And Morrow, I said, knew about the CF card slot before he'd had time to review the equipment log. He was looking for specific information he knew existed before he arrived. You're being very careful about your words right now, Len said. I'm trying to be. The name you want, Len said slowly, is probably not someone I can just give you a name for on a personal call. Understood. But if you were to look at the interagency coordination contacts list on the district drive, under emergency communication protocols, and look for the entry that's just labeled DOI comms, you might find a number. DOI comms, I said. That's all I can say about that. Daniel, are you safe? I'm in the truck at the trailhead. I'm going back up the trail in a few minutes. Don't do anything I'd fire you for. I'll try. He hung up. I wrote down DOI comms in my notebook, though I wasn't going to be able to look up that contact until I was back in Jackson. I drove about a mile back down the access road to a point where I had 2 bars of cell signal, which I'd noted on the drive up. I parked and got out of the truck and stood in the cold with my phone, and I thought about what I was doing. I was concealing information from a regional director. I was looking for a back channel to an entity I didn't know. I was doing this because a facilities tech had written, "It is learning the equipment in a calibration log before disappearing with 2 colleagues, and nobody could tell me where they were." The snow on the road glittered in the morning light. A Clark's Nutcracker crossed in front of me, fast and direct, the way they are. I watched it land in a white bark pine 50 yards off the road and do the thing they do, jamming seeds into the bark for winter, working with total focused purpose. I went back to Camp Harlow. Morrow was at the table when I came in. He had Roy's official log open in front of him. He looked at me when I came through the door. "You were out early," he said. "Took a bearing on the weather. Looking clear from the south. From the south. Storms moving through. Clear sky from the south." He looked at me for a moment. Then, "Gina found something this morning. You should come look." He took me out to the east side of the equipment shed. Gina was there with 2 other SAR members, looking at the ground. What they were looking at was a depression in the snow and soil, roughly circular, about 4 feet across, that hadn't been there the previous day. The snow inside the depression was gone, as if whatever had made the depression had also cleared it. The soil at the center was disturbed, churned slightly, the same kind of disturbance you'd see if something had pressed into it. One pressing, 4 feet across, single event. The impressions Carol had found at the base of the north face were smaller, maybe 18 inches each, and of the pattern that suggested a mobile creature. This was a single event, a single contact. Not weight in the sense of an animal sitting or lying down. The soil disturbance was radial rather than centered, spreading outward from the contact point, as if something had pressed down from above and the displaced pressure had moved outward. "What's the depth here?" I asked. Gina crouched and pushed a measuring rod into the soil. 4 inches of soil displacement. 4 inches of displacement from something pressing down. Or something pressing up, Carol said, from behind me. I turned around. She was standing with her arms folded. Pressing up, I said. The disturbance pattern. I've been looking at it for 20 minutes. The displacement moves outward and upward, like pressure from below. Like something came up through the ground, made contact with the surface, and then went back down. We all looked at the depression. That's not possible, Gina said, quietly and without conviction. I know, Carol said. Morrow had been listening. He said, I want this area cordoned off and photographed. Nobody touches the soil. He was using his operational voice, crisp and immediate, the voice of someone managing an active incident rather than a welfare check, which told me he was taking this seriously in a way that also told me he understood something about it. Morrow, I said. He looked at me. You know something about what's in this basin? I know what I can observe, he said. You knew about the CF card. You got here faster than a normal mobilization. You're managing this like an active incident rather than a missing persons case. He kept my gaze. Missing persons is an active incident. What's DOI comms? Something moved in his face, not much. The kind of movement you see in someone who was not expecting a specific thing and is now recalculating. Where did you hear that? He said. I'm asking if you know what it is. Where is the CF card, Daniel? I don't have it, I said. I think you do. I think you know more about what happened to those 3 people than you're saying, and I think that matters more right now than a CF card. He looked at me for a long time. The SAR team was pretending not to listen, which is something people do. The 3 people, Morrow said, quietly, are not in this basin. I can tell you that because we have a way of knowing. The thermal aircraft ran at 0300 last night, and the thermal imaging shows 0 heat signatures in the basin perimeter, except for the cabin. No hypothermia risk. They're not lying in the snow somewhere. They're not here. And you didn't think to mention that this morning? It changes the search posture. It moves the search to secondary locations, the drainage above, the access road, the lower basin. It also removes the urgency from looking in this basin specifically. He didn't say anything, which is what you want, I said. You don't want anyone looking closely at this basin. Or you do want it, but you want to control what happens when they look. I want to run an orderly search and welfare operation, he said, in the tone of someone who has said official things so many times that official things come naturally even when they're not the whole truth. What is the signal from the north face? I asked. The SAR team had stopped pretending not to listen. I don't know, Morrow said. Do you know someone who does? I think that's enough for now, he said. He walked away. I stood at the edge of the cordon depression and looked at it and thought about pressure from below. The next 12 hours were the most careful I've ever spent at a government facility. I stayed within sight of other people. I answered questions when I was asked, and asked my own carefully. I read the logbooks again, looking for anything I'd missed, and I found one thing, which was a small notation in Dr. Solberg's logbook from September that I'd skimmed over the first time because it seemed administrative. She'd written, in a section about equipment maintenance, satellite uplink showing ghost receives, not in transmission log. Asked Roy to check. Ghost receives not in the transmission log. The uplink had been receiving something that wasn't being recorded, which meant someone or something was sending through the uplink to the station, not just the station sending out through the uplink. Roy's spiral pad had focused on the outgoing signal, the basin signal being relayed through the station's uplink to wherever, but Solberg had noted something incoming, something coming in on a channel that didn't show in the logs, something that might not have been meant to be seen. I thought about this very carefully. A signal from the basin, going out through the uplink, and a signal coming in through the same uplink, a two-way contact, the station as a relay in both directions, and the question was, in both directions between what and what? The basin signal and something on the other end of the uplink, which meant there was an entity in the basin and there was something, somewhere at the other end of the university's data pipeline, or the Forest Service's network that had been in contact with it for weeks, maybe longer. The camp as an unwitting relay station between two points of contact that had been established before any of the three people at the camp had any idea what they were sitting in the middle of. It was a cold thought. I sat with it. In the early afternoon, the mounted search team came back from the upper drainage with nothing. No tracks beyond what you'd expect from wildlife. No sign of the three missing people anywhere in the 6 miles of drainage they'd covered. The track dogs at the trailhead had lost scent at the road, which suggested no one had walked out. There was no evidence of vehicle use on the access road beyond my own tire tracks. 3 people who had not walked out, not hiked out, not been driven out, and were not in the basin. I found Gina working on the medical kit at the cabin table in the late afternoon. She was competent and quiet, and I'd gotten the sense she was observant. I sat across from her. "You work a lot of wilderness SAR?" I asked. 4 years, she said, Wyoming and Idaho. "You ever work a case where the search turned up nothing?" "Not nothing eventually, nothing from the start." She thought about it honestly. "Once, hiker in the winds, late season. We searched for 4 days, full resources. He was never found. No remains, nothing. That happens, sometimes, with solo hikers in remote terrain. 3 people together?" "No," she said. 3 people together, no. There's always something. Because with 3 people, at least one of them will make choices that leave trace. Yes, unless, well, she set down what she was working on. Unless all 3 go somewhere at the same time for the same reason. Then they might not leave trace individually because they're all moving together and the movement is collective. Or someone else is driving the movement. She looked at me. I try not to do this job in a way that assumes bad things about missing people's situations before I have evidence. I'm not assuming bad things. I'm trying to account for an absence of trace in a 3-person group. The presence at the North Face Depression, she said, carefully, is what I'd call significant. I've never seen a displacement pattern like that. Geohydrology could explain it. In theory, a subsurface pressure event, a gas pocket, something like that. But there was nothing in the geology reports that suggested this area was a candidate for that. What would a subsurface pressure event do to people who were standing on top of it? Depends on the scale, she said. A small event, a methane pocket releasing, it might just frighten them or give them a headache. A larger event. She didn't finish that sentence. The depression was 4 feet across and the displacement was 4 inches. That's a small event by any geological measure. Yes, she said, and none of the team members reported any gas smell. No, so not a gas event. Probably not, she said. We looked at each other across the table with the shared understanding of 2 practical people who have reached the edge of what practical thinking covers. I didn't sleep the second night. I lay on the floor and I thought, and I listened. The sound from the north face didn't come. The router was still unplugged. Around 0300 I sat up and took out Roy's spiral pad and the CF card and my satellite communicator. I didn't turn any of them on yet. I just held them. 3 pieces of something that together were more than any piece was alone. Then I wrote a long message on the satellite communicator. I addressed it to Len, with a copy to an email address I constructed from the DOI comms notation, which Len had not actually explained to me, but which I guessed was probably a format along the lines of something at the Department of Interior. I described everything I'd found, in order. The spiral pad and its entries, the CF card and the calibration data, the sweeping signal and its adaptive response, Roy's note about it learning the equipment, Dr. Solberg's ghost receives, the cordon depression, the conversation with Morrow, the thermal imaging showing no heat signatures in the basin, the collective absence of trace. I ended the message by asking a specific question. I wrote, "Has this basin or any other location in the Gros Ventre Wilderness previously been identified as a site of anomalous signal activity? And if so, when, and by whom, and to what conclusion?" I held the communicator for a long time before I sent it. Then I sent it. The response came at 0512, not from Len, Not from whatever DOI comms was, from an address I didn't recognize, a string of numbers at a domain I'd never seen. It said, Mr. Reyes, the inquiry you sent at 0318 local has been received and flagged. We would ask you to hold the physical materials you described and not transfer them to any other party. A representative will contact you within 72 hours at a secure location of your choosing. Please do not communicate further about this matter on any unencrypted channel. Thank you for your service to the public lands. That was all. No signature, no name, no explanation of who had intercepted my message to DOI comms or how they'd gotten my satellite communicator address. I held the device and I thought about the phrasing. Thank you for your service to the public lands. That's Forest Service language. That's the internal language, the way people who work public lands talk to each other in formal contexts. Not natural, not something an outside entity would produce without familiarity with the culture. Someone inside was watching. Not the basin signal, not whatever was in the rock. Someone inside the system. And they wanted the materials I had. I decided, in the 40 minutes before the rest of the cabin woke up, that I was going to leave Camp Harlow. Not because I was frightened, though I was, but because staying meant Morrow would eventually get the card and the pad, and I didn't know yet whether Morrow was someone who would use them to find 3 missing people, or someone who would use them to manage the situation in the way that had already been managing it before I arrived. I packed quietly. I put the card and the pad in my chest pocket. I left most of my gear, enough to suggest I'd be back. I took my food and my communicator and my headlamp, and I went out the front door at 0555 into a dark and perfectly clear sky, the stars enormous over the basin, the snow from the previous day crunching under my feet. I stopped on the porch and picked up one of the boots, the rubber knee-high. I turned it over in my headlamp beam. It was Dr. Solberg's, based on the size. A good heavy boot, well used, the sole worn but adequate. I set it back down carefully. I walked across the basin toward the trail. I was passing about 60 feet from the north face when the sound came back. No router, no equipment, nothing plugged in, nothing transmitting. The sound was there anyway, and it was the clearest it had been, not behind a wall, not muffled by anything. The sweeping quality was there, the frequency was there, and it was close. Close in a directional sense I could feel in my teeth and in the small bones of my ears. I did not stop walking. I want to say I looked at the rock face as I passed. I did not. I kept my eyes on the trail ahead of me, and I kept moving at a pace that was not running, that was not the pace of someone frightened, but that was also not slow. I kept my headlamp aimed forward, and I did not aim it at the rock face. The sound changed as I walked. The sweeping slowed. It found a frequency and stayed on it, and the frequency was not unpleasant, and was not aggressive, if those are words you can use for a sound from a rock face at 11,000 feet in the dark. It was, if I'm being honest, more like attention. The way you feel when something's watching you, before you know what's watching you, that heightened awareness of being perceived. The sound felt like that, like I was being looked at, or listened to, or read somehow. I walked faster. At the lip of the basin, the top of the switchbacks, I stopped and looked back. The cabin was dark, the basin was white and flat, the north face was a black wall against the stars. Nothing moved. I went down the switchbacks and across the log bridge and through the spruce and the lodgepole and out to the parking lot where my truck was. I got in. I drove for 40 minutes before I stopped, pulled over at a wide spot on the highway, and got out and stood in the cold air and let my heart do what it needed to do. It needed to be loud for about 90 seconds. Then it settled. I drove to Jackson. I went to my apartment. I made real coffee for the first time in days, and I sat at my kitchen table with the CF card and Roy's spiral pad in front of me, and I decided what I was going to do. I was going to make copies of everything. I was going to send 1 copy to Len, and 1 copy to my personal email, and 1 copy to an account I set up on a new device I purchased that morning at a drugstore. I was going to write down everything I'd observed and experienced in the form of a complete and time-stamped account. I was going to hold the originals. and I was going to wait for the 72-hour window the message had described. Then, I was going to decide whether I trusted the entity that had sent that message. Spoiler, I did not. The contact came at hour 68, not through the satellite communicator, but through my personal cell phone, which was how I knew the original intercept had been thorough. My phone number was not in anything I'd sent. It had been found some other way. The voice on the phone was calm and male and said his name was Foster, which I did not believe to be his real name. He said he was with an office whose acronym I didn't recognize, and which I've subsequently been unable to find in any public organizational chart. He asked if I still had the materials. I said yes. He asked if I'd shared them with anyone. I said I'd briefed my supervisor, which was true. He said that was fine, that Len had already been contacted, and asked if Len had told me to cooperate. He had not. I did not say this. I said I was happy to cooperate if I understood the situation better. Foster said, "What we can tell you is limited. The site you were at has been a subject of monitoring for longer than you may realize. The signals Castillo documented are consistent with something we've observed at similar sites in other locations." "What sites?" I said. "I'm not at liberty to be specific." "Similar in what way?" "Signal characteristics, the adaptive behavior you described, the geographic markers." "What geographic markers?" "High-altitude isolated basins, specific geological substrates, granite with particular structural properties." "How many sites?" I said. He paused. "More than 2. "Are the people at those sites also missing?" A longer pause. "The situations at other locations are in various states of resolution." "That's not an answer." "The 3 individuals from Camp Harlow," he said, "are a priority of our organization as well as the search and rescue operation. Are they alive?" "We have reason to believe so." "What reason?" He paused again. "The signal at the basin has characteristics that suggest retrieval rather than termination. We believe they were taken rather than harmed." "Taken where?" "That is the question we're working to answer." "Are they underground?" I asked. Carol, the tracker, thought the pressure disturbance might be from below the surface. The pause this time was different, shorter, more specific. "We consider that a plausible hypothesis," he said. I was very quiet for a moment. Then I said, "When Roy wrote that it was learning the equipment, what was it learning to do?" "We think it was learning the frequency ranges, the bandwidth, the modulation methods. The equipment at that station used particular parameters, and whatever generated the basin signal was becoming able to match them exactly." "To what end?" "Communication," he said, "or something that functions like communication, from its end. The adaptive behavior is consistent with an attempt to establish a stable channel." "A channel to what? To the other end of the uplink? To the university servers? To wherever the calibration data went when it left the station?" "Yes," Foster said. "Exactly that." "And what was at the other end of the uplink? Who was receiving?" The pause was very long. "That's something we're still determining," he said, which was either the truth or a careful lie, and I wasn't sure which. "The people at the camp were using equipment that was being used as a relay," I said. "They didn't know it. They were living in the middle of a contact situation, and they were the unwitting infrastructure. That's one way to describe it. When they found out, Roy specifically, it disconnected the relay. It cut the channel." "Yes." "And whatever was establishing that channel responded." "We believe so." "What does it want?" I said. "The thing in the basin. What does it want?" Another very long pause. "We don't think want is the right frame. What we observe is function. It functions in certain ways that include establishing contact, learning communication systems, and reacting to disruption. Whether there's intentionality behind any of that, whether it's a driven entity with goals or a system following very complex natural processes, we don't know. But 3 people went into the ground. They went somewhere," he said. "And you think they're alive?" "We have reason to," he said again. We talked for another 20 minutes without me learning anything new that I trusted. He asked for the CF card, I told him I'd digitize the data and he could have the card, but the data was already in multiple locations. He was quiet about that for a moment, and then said that was probably wise of me. I didn't know what to do with that. He told me that an agreement would be coming through official Forest Service channels about the materials and about my participation in the ongoing assessment of the basin. He told me that Morrow would no longer be the point of contact and that I'd be dealing with a different chain. He said that Len had been briefed at a level appropriate to his position and that Len wanted me to continue cooperating. He said he hoped I understood the situation required discretion. I asked him if Dr. Solberg and Marcus and Roy had been told to be discreet. He said they hadn't had the opportunity. I thanked him for his honesty about that, and I meant it, and he acknowledged it, and I thought he was a person doing a difficult job in a system that was handling something genuinely unprecedented, and that he probably wasn't a bad person, and that none of that helped me feel better. I hung up and sat in my apartment for a long time. What I've done since then, over the intervening years, is not very dramatic. I cooperated with the assessment process. I gave them the CF card. I kept the digitized copies. I continued working at the district office, and I continued reviewing environmental assessments and coordinating equipment requests and sitting in on interagency meetings. And I never went back to Camp Harlow because Camp Harlow was closed for the subsequent winter and then closed the winter after that. And then, in the spring of the second year, the cooperative research agreement between the Forest Service and UW was quietly allowed to lapse. The official determination about the 3 missing persons, which came through the Fremont County system the following spring, was that Dr. Annika Solberg, Marcus Webb, and Roy Castillo were presumed deceased following an unwitnessed accident in difficult terrain in late October. A wildland fatality incident report was filed. Roy's family, I learned later, requested a memorial service in Lander, and I attended it, in a suit that was too warm for the weather that day, and I stood in the back, and I thought about the photograph of 2 kids at a beach that I'd seen on the shelf above his cot. The memorial was in a church with good acoustics. When the pastor spoke, the sound in the room had that quality I associate with enclosed spaces at altitude, a resonance that you feel as much as hear. I sat with my hands in my lap, and I didn't think about what that comparison implied. I have been careful about what I think about since then. Fremont County SAR closed the case file. The Forest Service filed the equipment as total loss due to damage. The antenna on the cabin roof, which I know from the facility's closeout report, was removed and discarded. The cabin was winterized and sealed. The basin is still there. The rock face is still there. Whether whatever was at the rock face is still there is not a question I've asked officially, and not a question I've gotten a reliable answer to informally. I still have the digitized copies of Roy's calibration data. I still have the digital photographs I took of the field notebook pages and the spiral pad. I look at them occasionally, not often, and I'm not sure what I'm looking for when I look. Maybe just to confirm that they're still there, that they're still real. The thing about something you can't explain, the thing I've found, is that over time the not explanation doesn't grow smaller. The gap doesn't fill in with whatever your brain reaches for to make sense of things. It stays the size it was. Roy's last 3 words. The depression in the snow with its radial pressure pattern. The sound that came back when there was nothing left for it to come back through. It knows now. What it knew and what it did with the knowing, and where 3 people are because of it, these are questions that sit in me the way the coal seams sit in the mountain. Quiet and pressurized and present in the dark. The last time I talked to Foster was about 14 months after the initial contact. He called my cell again, same number I'd saved under a placeholder name, and he said that some progress had been made in understanding the basin signal structure. He said that in 2 other locations with similar characteristics there had been, in his words, retrievals. People who had been missing from high-altitude research sites had been found alive in the surrounding terrain, with no explanation of how they'd gotten where they were found, or any clear memory of the intervening time. How long had they been missing? I asked. In one case, 8 months, he said. In the other, 11. And the Harlow 3? He paused. We remain optimistic, he said. It has now been 4 years since October of that year. By Foster's logic, they're past the range of the successful retrievals. By Fremont County's determination, they've been legally dead for 2 years. I remain something. Not optimistic exactly, more like unresolved. I remain unresolved. I still work for the Forest Service. Different district now, Caribou-Targhee, further south. Still mostly administration. My knee is about the same. My apartment in Driggs smells like my own dog now, a border collie mix named Perry, who has no interest in my work and a great deal of interest in the field behind the house where mice live in the grass roots. I watch him hunt sometimes in the evenings, working a scent trail with his nose 3 inches off the ground, and I think about how he's following something invisible and certain at the same time, something real that he can access and I can't. I think about access a lot, about channels, about what it means that something was trying, with real adaptive effort, to find a way to communicate through the infrastructure of a remote research station at 11,000 feet. Whether that effort was meaningful or mechanical, whether there's a difference between the two. I also think about the direction of the signal. Roy had focused on the outgoing direction, the basin signal going out through the uplink, but Solberg had noted incoming signal, ghost receives, something coming in. If something from the basin was sending out, and something at the other end of the uplink was sending back, then the contact was mutual. Both parties were trying to reach each other through the station's equipment, and one of those parties was in a granite basin in the Gros Ventre wilderness. What was the other party? That's the question I can't let go of, because it doesn't feel like it was the university's servers, which are just servers. It doesn't feel like it was any natural process. The incoming signals had structure too, if Roy's calibration data was showing bidirectional contact, structure that matched the outgoing structure. Someone on the other end knew what it was, had been talking to it, and was using the station and the 3 people in it as the bridge. Foster's organization, or something further upstream. Thank you for your service to the public lands. I've thought about what that means for 4 years. I think it means they knew what the station was doing. They'd known for a while, and they'd let it continue, because the contact it was enabling was valuable to someone, until Roy disconnected everything, and the channel went down, and the thing in the basin did what it did when its bridge was pulled. And 3 people got pulled along with it. That's the version I carry. I don't know if it's the right version. I don't have enough information to be sure, and I've accepted that I will probably not get enough information to be sure. What I have is a border collie in a field and a good coffee maker and a knee that's bad in the mornings and a digitized folder on a hard drive labeled with a date in October and the word Harlow. And the memory of walking through a basin in the dark, with something attending to me from the rock, something that had been trying for months to learn the language of human equipment, that had found it, and then lost the channel, and was looking for it again, sweeping through frequencies in the dark, patient and adaptive and close. I walked out. Those 3 people did not. I think about them most on mornings when the sky is that particular high-altitude blue, almost purple at the edges, 11,000 feet, clean air, a sound at the edge of what you'd call hearing. Some basins remember who was in them, or something that lives in basins does. Whether it's the same thing, I can't say.